All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Joshua Taylor, and for the next hour, we're going to spend some time discussing who is my ancestor, tracing individuals with similar names. Has anyone in the room or those watching online ever run into this problem before? Two individuals, right? Which one is yours? Which one is the other person's? How do you tell them apart? We run into this problem all the time as genealogists, and so we're gonna work through some tips and some tools that you can use to tell your ancestors apart. As we begin, please silence all electronic devices, no audio or video recording, and no photos, please, specifically of the slides. So let's start talking about who our ancestors are and how we trace those pesky individuals that love to name their sons John and Thomas and William, and their daughters Anne and Mary and Margaret. And we're trying to figure out, well, which one of these individuals is actually my ancestor? So as we get started, here's what we're going to do. We're going to understand the challenge ahead of ourselves, though many of us probably know what that challenge is. We're going to go through 5 key steps that you can use when tracing individuals with similar names. And we're going to see those steps in actions with a couple of examples so you can actually see it happen. And we'll empower you to apply those own steps in your own research. Now, I understand that this process is easier said than done. We're going to talk through examples that took years worth of research that you're going to see in about a couple of minutes, because that's the magic of a presentation, right? We can cut out all the really, really difficult parts. But we're going to learn the principles that can help you to repeat that at home. So what is the challenge? Well, we know that names are not necessarily always as unique as we would like them to be, right? We have the Johns, the Williams, the Mary, the Elizabeths, even the last names. Anybody have an ancestor in here named Smith with the last name? Look at all these cousins. Look at that, right? And all Smiths are related, right? Anybody got a Taylor? Yeah, I'm sure we're cousins, right? Somewhere along the lines. The challenge is that individuals are easily conflated and very often confused. In fact, this is a problem that genealogists have had ever since family history began as a study or a hobby or a pursuit. Printed genealogies and compiled materials conflated individuals. That information gets published and put into online trees, and what we have is essentially generations of assumptions. How many of you have ever had an online tree that's incorrect? I'm shocked. Well, the truth is we have to spend some time to figure out exactly how to ensure that we're not conflating individuals with the same name. The truth is that direct evidence in genealogy, that magic document that says John Smith is the son of William Smith and he was the son of John Smith and they lived here and they married who, that document rarely exists. What we deal with very often in family history is indirect evidence, where the information is not always given to us in one concrete document. Rather, our work as genealogists is to analyze what evidence we have, to look across those materials, and this requires diligence and patience. So let me tell you a story about the first ancestor whose name I confused with another's. This is my great-great-great-great-grandfather, George A. Stiles. George A. Stiles is buried in Freeport, Illinois, and his gravestone very nicely provides a date of birth of 27th of August, 1827. I was thrilled because back in the day of the IGI, and this is copyright 2002, as you can see, there was a George Stiles born in Massachusetts on the 28th of August, 1827. And I picked that up and said, you know what? That's my ancestor. Why wouldn't he be? It's only a day off, and we know that dates can be fuzzy. And so I proceeded to spend a lot of time building out a wonderful tree for George Stiles, the son of Martin Stiles and Mary Jennings Holt. The tree included all sorts of fascinating ancestors and great documentation, and for probably 15 years, this George Stiles and his ancestors were my ancestors. Until I looked back and realized that there was also an entry for George Alfred Stiles, born August 27, 1827, in Tompkins Township, Delaware County, New York. Same name, same-ish date, it's a day off, different places. But I'd gotten so excited about the first entry that I hadn't done my due diligence. There was actually a genealogy that had been printed where George A. Stiles and his mother actually provided information linking George Alfred Stiles, born August 27th in Delaware County, New York, to an Ashbel Stiles and Priscilla Dunbar that had died in Freeport, Illinois. Two individuals, same name. It's only a day, but boy, the pedigree looked a little different when I started working on it. I'm still trying to piece together the ancestry of George Stiles, of my George Stiles, as I call him. The good news is that both lines connect at the immigrant ancestor in Windsor, Connecticut, right around 1630. So I have a lot of research that isn't my own. And so I keep it, and one day I will meet the actual descendants of that other George Stiles, and I'll give them a whole bunch of information on their family. But this is so easy to do because names are sometimes the most non-unique part of an individual that we're tracing in our family history. Consider a very basic census record, like an 1850 US Census here in Buffalo, New York. John Smith, John Smith, John Smith. One born in Vermont, one born in England, one born in Massachusetts. Two, in fact, born in England. How do we know? Passenger lists and custom lists where there's an age that's given. No birth date, no other identifying information. So let's go over our 5 steps. And we'll go over each of these in depth, so no need to scribble quickly. First, we're going to learn how to put ourselves in the record creator's mindset. Then we're going to identify specific characteristics and patterns other than their name. Then we're going to research and create individual profiles for individuals of the same name. When necessary, we're going to shift the research objective entirely. And finally, we're going to write and share our research no matter what we find, because knowing who is not your ancestor is oftentimes just as important as knowing who your ancestor actually is. So step 1, the record creator. The record creator is your strategic partner in this process. As a compiler, as a creator of records, as a town clerk, as a local historian, the record creator had the responsibility to tell individuals apart with the same name. Now, it's very possible that they simply said, name, John Smith, and wrote John Smith. But if you're a town clerk and you're living in, say, Grafton, New Hampshire, and it's 1810, and 3 men live in town with the same name of John Smith, wouldn't you find a way to make sure that every time you note them in the records, you include something that tells them apart for your own sake? What about for the next generation? What about for the next clerk? So put yourselves in the mindset of the record creator. How did that record creator tell them apart, and what clues did they leave over time in those various records that you can latch onto to help tell these individuals apart? Record creators have amazing tools at their hands beyond just the person's name. They might name someone senior and junior, but senior and junior doesn't always mean father and son. Senior and junior could simply mean the older one or the younger one, or it could mean the person who arrived in town earlier than the other one. Junior and senior could actually only be 2 years apart, but one of them is senior and one of them is junior. That's a record creator's tool to tell 2 individuals apart. And what happens when Thomas Smith Sr. passes away or moves? Junior becomes senior. Oh, and then we've got to do some work. Sometimes you name individuals with a Roman numeral or with a number, first, second, third. Thomas Smith III might not mean that there are 3 generations of Thomas Smiths in the same town at the same time. It could mean that there are 3 men named Thomas Smith. Thomas Smith I, Thomas Smith II, and Thomas Smith III. Maybe you apply a title or a descriptor. Elder Thomas Smith could mean an elder in a church, or it could mean simply the older Thomas Smith. And then maybe you use an actual word like Thomas Smith II, or an occupation, Thomas Smith blacksmith, Thomas Smith farmer. Maybe you actually give a genealogical clue in the way you identify the ancestor by naming someone Thomas Smith, son of John. Well, that Thomas Smith is the son of John, that Thomas Smith is the son of William, and that's how the record creator could tell them apart. And maybe you actually spell out the younger. These clues are waiting for us everywhere in the documents that we look at. These are the printed vital record transcripts from Ipswich, Massachusetts, and we see this being put into action when it comes to John Smith. The record creator here has specifically used identifiers to point out whom is whom with the exact same name who lived in the town at the same time period. Farmer, junior, someone who's a captain, someone who wasn't necessarily given any other details other than deacon. He was probably a deacon. The junior there was killed by lightning, something the clerk noted that was certainly probably distinctive about his his situation. But these clues exist in records and are important for us to consider. This applies to women as well as men in records. How do you tell Sarah Smith apart? By who she married. Here we have Sarah, the widow of Daniel, Sarah, just widow, and Sarah, widow of Peter. The record creator here has given you the tools to tell these individuals apart. In this case, for Thomas Smith, the record creator used occupation. Here's Thomas Smith Inholder versus Thomas Smith Wheelwright. And if we skip ahead and look in land and town records, these same distinctions carry through in deeds, in minute books within the town, and even within the local church records. It's how the town knew Thomas Smith. Thomas Smith was Inholder or was Thomas Smith Wheelwright. Census enumerators sometimes do this as well. Here we see someone using Adam Smith Jr. and Sr. right next to each other within a census enumeration. And here we see a very clever enumerator on the same page who thinks that you're going to have a hard time telling which John Smith is your John Smith. Because one, they identified as John Smith the tanner. The other one is John Smith of Philip. Now I'm hoping that my John Smith is the one whose father's name is Philip, because now I have a father's name. Unfortunately, it was the tanner in this case, but that's the way it goes. Possible identifiers exist everywhere within the mindset of the record creator. Generational distinctions, relationships, ages, occupations, length of residence in a community, or a specific title. Take time and track how the individual you're tracing is treated in the records. Be aware, online abstracts and online transcriptions oftentimes will leave out these important details. When you're indexing a document and you see Thomas Smith Inholder, you're probably directed to key that as Thomas Smith, which means if you're looking at an index, you have to look at the original record to find that extra distinction. So remember, designations can shift over time and actually could be part of the indirect evidence you need to tell an individual apart. Record creators can also change over time and apply their own systems. And the identifiers, again, can be missing in indexes, in abstracts, and transcriptions. It's why going back to that original record is always an essential part of research when you're telling two individuals apart. Shifting identifiers can be tremendous clues. Here we have a land transaction between Samuel Pierce of Grafton, New Hampshire, and David Bullock. Samuel Pierce is listed here as the individual purchasing the property, and one of the witnesses is Samuel Pierce Jr. Now, even though the clerk that recorded the land record was not the same town clerk that recorded the vital records, the distinction of Samuel Pierce Jr. carried forward. A few years later, Samuel Pierce Jr. was married with the distinction specifically of being a junior. However, his father passed away shortly after, and Samuel Pierce Jr. became simply Samuel Pierce of Orange. The generation shifted, and Samuel Pierce Sr. was no longer mentioned in specific records. The record creator shifted, and even though it was a different clerk recording the records, they maintained the designation of junior up until the point when there was no longer a need to. So step 2, characteristics and patterns. So sometime when you're doing this process, I want you to sit down and you can use a sheet of paper, you can use notes on your phone or your tablet, you can use a Word document or whatever sort of program you use, and I want you to write down everything you know about that ancestor except for their name. We rely so much on names in our research that sometimes we forget that there is a lot more to an individual than just their name. Sometimes the name is the most unhelpful clue that we have. Because if I have 10 John Smiths, that doesn't tell me which John Smith is my John Smith. So we have to make sure that we identify each and every characteristic other than that person's name. Here are a few things that we want to make sure we identify. Their occupation. Even if the occupation is something that you might not necessarily see as noteworthy, right? They're not knight, king, or prince, they're a farmer. That's great, celebrate your farming, your agricultural ancestors. Knowing who John Smith the farmers were versus John Smith the innkeeper helps you to tell them apart. If you don't know the occupation, maybe that becomes your next research goal. If someone shifts occupations, identify that, attach a time period to it. Education. Could your ancestor read and write? Did they sign documents with a mark? Signing documents with a mark versus signing with a signature is a characteristic that distinguishes individuals apart. Together, all these characteristics can help you to figure out who your ancestor actually is. Religious beliefs and practices. If your ancestor is a member of a particular religious organization, how do they interact with others in that community? Do they only interact with the fellow Baptists in that exact area? Do they identify themselves as an elder or a deacon in a particular church? What language do they use in land and court and other documents that might reflect a religious belief? Are they a member of the Society of Friends or the Quakers and use specific thee and thou language when they draft a particular document? These are all clues to tell individuals apart with the same name. What do they do when they're not just sitting there on the census waiting to be found? What about their social clubs, their fraternal organizations? What do you know about that person other than their name? Do they come from a family that was a member of a local Masonic lodge or another fraternal organization? These are identifiers that help you tell individuals apart. What about their economic status? If you're looking at tax records and estates as they're valued in probate records or land records or census records, can you get an indicator of someone's economic status based upon how much they're buying and selling property for? Absolutely. The John Smith that constantly buys large amounts of property for £2,000 to £3,000 versus the John Smith that buys a smaller amount of property for £100 or £200 at the same time could potentially be two very different individuals. So it gives you that indicator to know that you have two people with the same name interacting in the same community. So pay attention to those types of details. When you're using tax records and you have a list and there's 10 John Smiths, look at the personal property, the horses, the cows, the hogs, the wheat, the products, the crop. Something drastic would happen for an ancestor to suddenly have 1 horse one year and 100 horses the next year. Track the pattern in individuals, and you'll be able to identify those characteristics. Look at their children's names specifically, and especially those middle names, as you tell individuals apart. Who do they name their first son or their first daughter after? Knowing these characteristics, other than that individual ancestor's name, is critical and important in this process. Look for evidence of parentage or ancestry. Are there known clues about a relative that you have that helps you to tell them apart? Do you know someone constantly lived, for example, next to a brother? And so in every single record you see, you identify them not by their own name, but by the name of the brother who's living next to them. What about their residence or residences? Tracking these individuals over time, where they lived, again, other characteristics other than their name. Their migration history. What other families do they continually move with that helps you to identify them? The best way to trace a Smith is to find the most unusual surname who always lives around and interacts with that Smith. You'll be able to point them out in a record. So look for those other characteristics other than the precise name of your ancestor. Look at property ownership. If you have an ancestor that you think is yours, and you see them buying and selling massive amounts of property, but your ancestor didn't leave a will and didn't have any sort of estate distributed, is it really the same person? Now, it might be. They could have distributed that property elsewhere. But that would be evidence for you to find as you work to tell them apart. And then there is the much broader question the much more expansive issue of friends, neighbors, associates, and relatives, and this leads into our third step, which is the individual profiles. This is a process that requires patience and diligence, and your acceptance that you will be tracing ancestors whom are not your own. They are others, and that's okay. The best way to know who your ancestor is to know who he or she isn't in the records. So we build profiles, we are diligent and consistent in the process. We create detailed timelines, and we tie that to direct pieces of evidence rather than assumptions that we might have made. We start with a blank sheet, and we figure out what was this Thomas Smith doing in 1760 or 1830 versus the other Thomas Smith. Here are some elements to consider including in those individual profiles. Your personal biographical details, dates, birth date, marriage dates, places, what source, what evidence you have of that information. Family events and milestones for someone's immediate family. It's very, very difficult for two women named Sarah to give birth to a son 3 months apart. Knowing that in the timeline helps you identify which Sarah might be your Sarah. These are the specific clues that you look within that immediate family. It is very difficult, but not impossible, for someone to be in two places at once on a record. There are circumstances of double enumerations in census records, but it's pretty difficult. Extending this process to members of the extended family, to cousins and others that might interact with that individual, identifying those events and milestones, again, helps you to tell those individuals apart. And that entire list of characteristics that we just talked about for discussing about your own individual ancestor, do it for everyone with the same name. It's a lot of work, I understand, on people that might not be your ancestor, but it's the critical path to telling them apart. Social and economic circumstances and the associates and the extended networks. You will start to identify clusters and family units and groups of associates in this research. And you'll be able to begin telling, well, this family, this Jones family, they all have witnesses with the Poindexter family. So maybe there's a connection there. And so if I'm looking at a record and there's not a Poindexter identified in that record, it might be for a different family. This is where the timeline approach becomes incredibly important. Start with what you know, start with a blank slate, identify missing information, use color coding and other tools as needed, and specifically look for areas where things overlap, things conflict, or where there are very clear differences between individuals. Children being born too close to one another. 4 Johns in one family with no evidence of a death, for example, of any one. So they named four sons John. It could happen as an outlier. Did it happen? You'd have to point to evidence that said that it did. You might be dealing with 4 different individuals who all named a son John. Let's see this in action with a relative of mine, Ezra Kingsley. Ezra's one of my favorites because I still don't know that much about him, but here's what I do know. In 1840, he's living in Adams County, Illinois, and he was between the age of 50 and 59. That allows me to identify something about him, that he was likely born between 1781 and 1790. On my timeline, I'm going to work backwards, and I'm going to identify what I know about that Ezra Kingsley. In 1830, I know from documentation from his children that he was living in Bridgewater, Susquehanna County, Pennsylvania. I find an Ezra there in the 1830 census, and it is consistent with his age that he is born likely between 1781 and 1790. Back another 10 years, and I find him in Bridgewater in the 1820 census, age 26 to 44, which means this Ezra is born between 1776 and 1794, still within that gateway to be my ancestor. So this is looking fairly easy and straightforward until I get to 1810. Do you know how many Ezra Kingsleys there are in the country in 1810? Not as many as John Smith's, but there's plenty of Ezra Kingsleys, none of whom are living in Susquehanna, Pennsylvania. They're living everywhere else. So I took a list of Ezra Kingsley, which I will spare you for seeing that entire list. It's got about 25 people on it in different variations. And I narrowed it down to the 3 households that have a male in that household between 20 and 29 with 2 likely children under 5, which is another characteristic that I had gleaned from those 1820, 1830, and 1840 censuses. Now, this method could work, but it could also have a flaw in it. Ezra might not be head of the household in 1810. So I have to consider that as an outlier in this process. But I'm going to see what I can find out about these 3 potential Ezra Kingsleys to see if any of them might match up with details about my ancestor Ezra Kingsley. So first, I start with his timeline. He's born between 1781 and 1790. He had 2 children, likely born between 1805 and 1810, a girl and a boy. He had another 2 children born between 1810 and 1820. By 1820, he's in Susquehanna County, Pennsylvania. He had a daughter, likely born between 1821 and 1825, likely a girl and a boy, born sometime between 1825 and 1830. In 1830, he's living in Susquehanna County, Pennsylvania, and in 1840, he's living in Adams County, Illinois. There are the bare bones details of the individual I know as my quote-unquote Ezra Kingsley. Then I spend time expanding the profile. Land ownership. I identify that Ezra Kingsley of Bridgewater, Pennsylvania, bought a sawmill and operated a sawmill while he was there. I research each of those individual children that I believe are connected to him to see if there's any clues. I look at tax records, which helps me to more carefully identify when he arrived in Susquehanna County, Pennsylvania. And I use newspapers. And I use these same tools for each profile of these Ezra Kingsleys listed in the 1810 US Census. I look specifically for similarities, and I also make sure that I'm making a point to identify differences between them. So the Ezra Kingsley of West Hampton, Massachusetts can actually be found there in 1800, 1820, and 1830. That's not my ancestor. Same name, not my ancestor, because he's not coexisting in 2 places at the same time. Also, he is definitely not my ancestor because newspapers tell me that this Ezra Kingsley was struck by lightning and killed on August of 1835. My Ezra is very much living in the 1840 census. Not my Ezra Kingsley, but I now know how to pick him apart when I look at different records. Then the Ezra Kingsley of New York and Massachusetts. This Ezra Kingsley migrated. I can find a birth of this Ezra Kingsley as the son of Seth Palmer Kingsley in Otis, Massachusetts, and based upon the tick marks in the census records, it appears that this is the Ezra Kingsley that moved from Otis into Plymouth, New York, where he passed away. Now, we're going to do the magic of pressing a button and skipping 10 years worth of research. Here I have all my Ezra Kingsleys, and I've identified them in census records. I've looked at them, I've identified the likely marks for children, and now what I have is a table that looks really nice and represents a lot of research. But what does it actually tell me? Well, this is when I add some color, literally, and I start to see how to tell these people apart. I identified and gave each of these individuals a specific color type, and then I applied those colors to the sheet, and I can very, very clearly see where the other Ezra Kingsleys are versus my Ezra Kingsley. The most exciting part about this process is that I was just trying to figure out where my Ezra was in 1810. I actually found his father in the process because he's enumerated right next to Ezra Kingsley Sr., identified as his father. So I solved 2 things at once without even realizing what I was doing. This process takes time and it takes patience, but it is very, very possible to tell 2, 3 to 4 individuals apart. As you engage in this process, it will take time. This is from a War of 1812 pension application file for a man named Luther Clark. Luther Clark is a brother of a relative of mine, and he's very critical because he keeps being attached to various land transactions. When I went to pull what I thought was his pension file, one of the first cards notes that there are two men with the exact same name of Luther Clark who served in the exact same unit in the War of 1812 from the exact same town. And both men applied for a pension, and both men were immediately denied because the pension office couldn't verify which one was which. And so what proceeded for the next 15 years were a series of affidavits and documentation as the pension office and these two Luther Clarks, who, by the way, both moved to a county in Wisconsin that was literally 10 miles apart. So they're using the same attorney, they're using the same clerk, and they're submitting affidavit after affidavit after affidavit, and they never got it sorted out. At the end of the day, when you pull this original pension file, it's both men conflated, confused, and unresolved. The pension file of Luther Clark from Salem, Washington County, New York, is actually the pension file of both Luther Clarks, and the pension office itself at one point says, we simply cannot tell which individual is which, and leaves it at that. And here I am in 2024, still trying to sort out their mess from the 1880s and 1890s. I will figure it out one day, but pulling the pension file was not the good answer, because I learned that I was just opening a can of worms, so to speak, that the pension office hadn't been able to resolve. So when you find yourselves in these types of situations, sometimes you have to move on to the fourth step, where you actually start to shift the research objective. Take a step back from your research, from the John Jones or the William Smiths or the Sarah Browns that you're trying to figure out which one is your ancestor. Take a step back and review your profiles and look at a much larger or more impactful picture and ask yourself, why is telling those two people apart my objective? Why is it so important to me that I know which person is my ancestor? I would really, really like to be able to know every single census record that exists for my ancestor. After all, I want to do reasonably exhaustive search. However, I might never know definitively. And I might be spending time on a research objective that really is outside of the bigger picture of trying to find someone's maiden name or someone's parents, or trying to find a missing child of a particular couple, or the maiden name of a wife. So make sure that we understand why telling them apart is really the objective that you have at that point for your research. Look to see if there is an objective that potentially provides new information. Evidence of someone's residence, evidence of parentage, additional biographical detail, or a pivotal clue. My objective for Luther Clark is no longer to figure out which Luther Clark is my Luther Clark. My objective is to figure out all the Luther Clarks in New York between 1810 and 1820. Why? Because I know that amongst those Luther Clarks is my Luther Clark, but telling them apart based upon this pension file is just an overwhelming task. So I'm going to break it, I'm going to shift that objective. I'm simply going to get to know the Luther Clarks in New York in that time period and move forward. And after that was a bit difficult, I stepped back even further and said, you know what? This man had 6 brothers. Luther was only one of them. I'm going to shift to the other brother, because maybe knowing them apart is not going to accomplish my overall objective, which is figuring out who their parents are. So I shift to the next sibling and move on. Now, I will revisit Luther from time to time, because we all need some good frustration once in a while, right? I'll go back to it. But I was able to figure out the parents of my ancestor in that entire situation, not by focusing on Luther, by stepping back and looking at the other siblings, because there are other options available to me. I absolutely pigeonholed myself just by focusing on Luther. Sometimes we have to shift our objective to disprove rather than prove. Proof is an interesting thing in genealogy. Proof is only as good and concrete until the next record comes in your hands and it contradicts something. Sometimes you simply need to take the objective of proving that that person is not your ancestor. Sometimes you might need to go through a process of elimination. Maybe you're looking through, as I did with the Ezra Kingsley example, 4 or 5 individuals with the same name and eliminating them one by one by one, because that's part of the process. So some possible shifting objectives. Being able to simply identify who isn't your ancestor in a much more easy fashion. To be able to look at a record and say, nope, nope, nope. That's the inholder. My guy is not the inholder. Or, that's the Sarah who married Thomas, not the Sarah who married William. I know who that person is. Maybe your objective is simply to do a previous step, which is to find all of those other characteristics other than the name. And in that process, who knows what you might discover? Maybe you'll find that someone was a member of a particular religious organization, which leads you to a great set of religious records that actually solves another research objective. Maybe you simply want to ensure, as an objective, that you're identifying that potential assumptions are correct or incorrect. Maybe you want to double-check yourself or others. So last year, I had what I call one of those shattering genealogical moments. As many of you know, that I started family history with my grandmother. She was a DAR member. She submitted a line for a patriot ancestor of Samuel Pierce. That line was submitted by her mother and her mother and her mother. They were early members, and I've been proud of that heritage from the very, very beginning. And I got an email from someone that said, "Are you really sure that Samuel is the son of Samuel? Because I think this is wrong." And I said, "But I have a letter from 1872 from my great-great-great-grandmother that says it's so." And they said, "Well, yeah, but the book came out in 1870 and had the line wrong." Okay. So I began to meet all of the men in the world named Samuel Pierce. Samuel Pierce in Bristol County, Massachusetts is not as challenging as John Smith. Ezra Kingsley was a bit of a debacle. Samuel Pierce, everyone named their son Samuel. There's actually 3 Pierce families that arrived. They all love the name Samuel, and so I had to shift my objective. Here I have a list from a land record index of grantee and grantors selling property, because one of the key ways of figuring out which Samuel Pierce was my Samuel Pierce was to start to look through land transactions to see what I could learn about each member of the family. This is just one page of many, many, many. So my objective at that point actually became to trace each property transaction, both in the deeds and the mortgage records that were indexed under Samuel Pierce. And I learned a lot about geography and shifting changes and boundaries at that period. Transactions, because of the way that counties were created, extended not only in the Bristol records, which, by the way, has 3 land registry districts, but they also extended into Plymouth County, and some of the transactions were double recorded in Plymouth County and in Bristol, because as areas split off, they wanted to make sure there was a recording locally of that transaction. In the end, and I don't expect you to read every single citation there, this is simply the example of all of the land records that I had to sort through to figure out which Samuel Pierce might be my Samuel Pierce. In the end, there were more than 10 individuals living in the exact same space at the exact same time period named Samuel Pierce. It's possible that there were only 5 or 6, but I'm still working to tell some of these individuals apart. I treat Samuels as individuals until I know they're the same person, because I never want to assume that I have the same ancestor right in front of me. And this is where that final step comes into play, which is to write and share our research. As I was working through the more than 10 Samuels, I realized that the only way to tell the world about the Samuel Pierce who I actually was related to, which, by the way, was a completely different person than my family had had for now 100 plus years. So I have new Pierce relatives. I'm so happy. A whole bunch of people. But the only way to make sure that I could tell mine apart was to continue writing and sharing about the Samuel Pierces that I had been finding. Because all of these other Samuel Pierces have descendants, many of whom are genealogists. They've all taken DNA tests. They've all engaged in the process. And they all become tools and assets to me in telling Samuel Pierces apart. Writing and sharing is the most important step in telling an ancestor apart. Challenge yourself with the blank page and identify everything you know about that ancestor. It is the most important step. Taking that pause and writing what you find and what you know. You don't have to write a complete article or sketch for that individual. Technology and other tools can make this a very, very interesting and engaging process. WikiTree, for example, has a tag that you can add that they call the easily confused tag. So when you're looking at a profile of Robert Smith or of Samuel Pierce, there's a tag that identifies that individuals frequently confuse these two men or women or families. That tag is so helpful to me as a researcher because I know that I'm not alone, and I know that it's very, very easy for individuals to be frequently confused, and at least I know that from this tag. When you are publishing and using online trees, I build trees for all of those other individuals that I'm tracing because I want to have a place to share that information. Sites like WikiTree, FamilySearch, Find My Past, My Heritage Ancestry, and of course, many, many more. Sometimes you might be motivated to publish an article in a genealogical publication, a local genealogical society newsletter or journal, or even a peer-reviewed journal, such as the American Genealogist, the National Genealogical Society Quarterly, the New England Historical and Genealogical Register, or the New York Genealogical and Biographical Record. You might have a couple of paragraphs that helps to unlock the mystery of someone else trying to piece together individuals who are the same name. So where am I at with Samuel Pierce? I know who my Samuel Pierce is now based upon a long series of indirect and direct evidence, but I also know who all of these other 10 Samuel Pierces are, and I've begun to build sketches for each of them. I probably will not complete these at the end of the project. I will write enough to the point where I can distinguish them from my Samuel Pierce, because half of them are actually all his second cousins. Samuel was a popular name in that family. Samuel, son of Samuel, son of Samuel. And in this process, even down to the marker on someone's gravestone, Thomas Smith II, buried, or Samuel Pierce II, buried in the same graveyard as Samuel Pierce I. Not father and son, not related, simply how they were identified in that town for years and years and years. Literally marked on their gravestone in the cemetery. That process is important because I can't tell the world about the right Samuel Pierce in my family without sharing how I know it's not any of these other Samuel Pierces. The process of writing will very oftentimes help to confirm your suspicions. Re-examining your proof, having the opportunity to remind yourself why you think something is the way it is in a tree. And it also helps you to identify new avenues that you might want to pursue. Nothing shows your holes in research or areas that could be looked into a bit further than a blank spot on the timeline or a blank paragraph, or when you start to write something up and you realize that that's conflicting information. So, some parting advice. Use logic and reasoning. So often in genealogy, we forget the logical part of things. No, Samuel Pierce did not live in Taunton, Massachusetts and in North Carolina 2 years apart in the year 1790. He just didn't. Use reasoning as you work through the process when you're trying to tell individuals apart. Identify the patterns. They're there. They're left for us. They just take our diligence and patience to uncover them. Be very cautious of assumptions. You are not the first genealogist who will conflate individuals with the same name, and you're not the last. I'm still trying to sort out my George Stiles online. And if you go online to different family trees, he's in the wrong tree all the time. Because of course, there's 100+ trees that have it incorrect, and it's easy just to copy that in. Be cautious of those assumptions. Be patient. That direct evidence, the lightning bulb document that gives you exactly what you need, probably doesn't exist to tell the individuals apart. You're going to create that because you're going to write that article so someone else can find it. But it takes the indirect evidence that you're looking at and your patience to actually tell individuals apart. Remember that every clue is a step toward the answer. Some clues are big, some clues are small, but everything you learn about a John Smith in the same place at the same time period as your ancestor puts you one step further to telling who your John Smith is. So in review, our 5 steps. We have to put ourselves in the record creator's mindset, right down to the individual who crafted the gravestones of the Samuel Pierces in the same cemetery. That record creator told them apart, literally in stone. We have to put ourselves in the record creator's mindset. Look for the clues that they left behind, the designations, the distinctions that they offer us, and make sure that we're recording these. We have to identify these specific characteristics and patterns other than someone's name that exists in these documents. They are there. Again, sometimes the name is the least helpful part of research. We have to spend time researching and creating those individual profiles. That is incredibly important to know exactly who your ancestor is and who they might not be. If necessary, we have to shift the objective. We have to spend a good 6 months in land records and deeds and learn more about the history in the area so we understand exactly the families that we're dealing with. And finally, and most importantly, we're going to make sure that we write and we share that research. I cannot emphasize enough when it comes to telling individuals apart, start writing that story now, start documenting what you have now, and you'll start to see what other research avenues you can pursue. I started working on Samuel Pierce's written narrative the very first hour I started researching the problem. And 250 pages later, I figured it out. Now I've just got to get it all online at a certain point, but that's the next step. And then, of course, there's the wives of all these individuals, because they all married Mary and Mercy and Phoebe, but I'll sort that out. So, what have we accomplished together in our time? Well, we know the challenge, though again, we probably knew that walking in the door. We know steps that we can use to trace individuals with similar names, and we've seen a couple of examples of those steps in action. We know that it takes patience, and so we're ready, ideally, to apply those steps within our own research. Now, I will say, tracing individuals with similar names is something that every person who pursues family history is likely to encounter. Names, unfortunately, and because of the way that they're carried through, become real hallmarks and characteristics within a family. And the best way to honor your father, Thomas Smith, who had 10 children, is to make sure that you name a son Thomas, so that all of their cousins share the same name. Because that's how they honored those individuals. At least you have 10 individuals to try to tell apart. And they will leave you clues. Because Thomas, who's the third son, will inherit something differently than Thomas, who's the first son of the elder brother. Those are all characteristics and ideas that they will leave you in your own research as you move forward. So with that, before we take questions, RootsTech's asked to remind that you give feedback on the app. You can find this session in the RootsTech mobile app. You can scroll down to fill out the survey and let RootsTech know how the session was. So we have a few minutes left. What questions can I answer about tracing individuals with similar names? And if you can step to the microphone, that way we can hear people at home, or we'll work to hear you from here and we'll repeat the question. But what questions do you have?
If you're not a professional genealogist or well-known, how do you publish so that people can find this information?
All right, what a good question. So if you're not a professional genealogist or well-known, how do you publish so people can find the information? Here is the best thing about publishing a genealogy. You don't have to be a professional to publish in these journals. All you have to do is submit your article to the editor, and the editors will help you through the process. Editors are great. They're not scary people. I work with editors every day at the NYGNB. They will help you through the process. Some of the best articles that have been written are not written by professional genealogists. They're written by those with a passion and a commitment to that family. So you don't have to be a professional to submit. The only thing you have to do is submit. They'll typically have a template or a guideline that will walk you through sort of their citation style. But submit what you have. They might go back and say, this isn't appropriate at this point, it needs more revision. But the first step really is to submit. There's no qualifiers needed there. Yes?
This is a follow-up to her question. How would we get a peer review of our findings?
A good question. How do you get a peer review of your findings? So there are a couple of ways to do that. When you submit to one of the peer-reviewed articles or journals like the American Genealogist or NGSQ, there is a review process that typically is done as part of that. There are also great interest groups and genealogical societies that might have individuals that will do peer review as part of a meeting or a session. I know a lot of genealogical societies have interest groups that will meet and do peer review for others where you exchange research. I peer review myself with other genealogists, professional and non-professional, all the time. But it's something, if you can contact a local society, submit to a journal, you'll have a peer review that takes place. Good question. Yes.
I have Amish Mennonite, and my great-great-grandfather was Jacob T. Wenger, and his brother was Joseph T. Wenger when they moved to a community that had 1,000 Wengers. I have no idea where the T came from. Do you have any recommendations for it? Because it's not from their mother's maiden name, and Wenger, ideas?
So she's tracing individuals, so she has two brothers that both use T as a middle initial, but we don't.
Once they are in that community, that's how they're identified.
Okay, once they're in that community.
Right.
All right. So that is a very interesting question, because that's probably an identifier that they used. So a couple of things that I would consider as you're looking at that. Who the person writing the T actually is. Is it themselves or is it a clerk? So has it been applied to them, or have they applied it themselves? How consistent is it in various records? And it very well could be that the T, because it's given to both, it could be the same name, it could be a reference. We might never know if it's just a T or if it's Thomas or something else. But I would spend some time and figure out if you can answer the question of who used the designation first, and then work through from that process. But I would probably say, just gut instinct without seeing the documents, it probably was because they moved in and there were other people with the same name and they used it to tell themselves apart. Yes?
Is there a technique or a trick to keep people from populating the wrong person on your tree? I have isolated many of the Lydias who are not my Lydia, but they still show up in my tree, and then they show up when I'm researching, and they use my tree as a resource. Yep. And I'm going, no, that's not her.
So the question is there any way to prevent people from populating trees with some of that inaccurate detail, or some of the information that you know is correct, and especially not using your own tree as the source? I do not know of a solution for that. I know a lot of online trees and programs work to include that. One thing that I make sure that I do is when I post on a tree, I include the citations, I include the evidence behind it. And at a certain point, I have to look above and pray for grace that I know what I have and I can't control what the other people are going to do. I've stopped changing George A. Stiles' parents on online trees because every time I do, I get my own old tree back as a source that says that I'm wrong. And it is a part of I think the reality that we're in, but I don't know of a good concrete way to prevent that from happening.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
How likely would it be in the case of a marriage record or something that's a legal, civil record, would it be for the person creating that record to use, for instance, if her name was Mary, but she went by Polly, everybody went by Polly, would they use the nickname rather than their given name?
So a good question. So how often, like in a civil record or an official marriage register, would someone use a nickname rather than a given name? Anything can happen, and it particularly depends upon how the information was given and who the clerk was in that case. I have seen, actually, the Mary Polly is a great example. I have an ancestor who has a marriage license and certificate. She's Mary E. Price. Her license is Mary E. Price. Her certificate is Molly Price because she used the nickname Molly. And it's the same document filed right next to each other in the courthouse. It just was the way that it was put together. So I'd say it's possible it happens.
Would you say likely or unlikely?
Likely or unlikely. I would say more likely as long as there's no other conflicting pieces of evidence. Yes.
How do you hold the people that you're not sure are related to your person in your tree?
Good question. How do you hold people in your tree that you're not sure are related? So I have a family tree file that I call related but not really. And it is essentially where I put all of these other people. I don't put them in a main tree at all. I add them in there. There's a whole bunch of unconnected trees, and I keep them that way so that I can always refer to them. But I keep them in a separate tree. I don't ever want to accidentally confuse them in that case. But I keep them separately. Yes.
I have a great-grandfather named John Howard from Hart County, Kentucky. And there are a lot of John Howards, and unfortunately the courthouse burned down. So I'm very limited in my records, and there are no children except my great-great-grandmother. And I'm wondering where to go from there if I can't expand the search.
Okay, so we have a John Hubbard. There's lots of John Hubbards in the area. John Howard. You're in an area with a burned courthouse. So a couple of things. I would start, and you might have already been going down this path, but start identifying what you know about all the John Howards in that area. Right. Start with the census enumerations. Work to see what property they have valued, and see what you can do to determine which ones are not your John Howards.
I've done that. It's very limited.
Okay.
Of the records, the census records and the land records.
And then I would take any other individual with a surname of Howard, and I'd start to put them into surname families, surname groupings.
Okay.
And put them together, because John Howard did not exist.
By himself.
He did not. So I'd look specifically at all the other Howard families, and that same process that you would have done with all the John Howards, do it with the Roberts and the Thomases and all the others.
In surrounding counties, perhaps?
Yep, surrounding counties. I usually, 5-mile radius as the crow flies is how I start, and then I extend from there.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. We have time for one more quick question.
Just the woman who asked how to keep people from putting the erroneous things back in your tree. I've started on FamilySearch at least. They have that new alert note. So I will write up why their assumption is wrong and title it, Why Aquila is Not the Father of This Elijah. I put it in memories, but I also mark it as an alert note. So at least they have that big banner saying, don't mess with this until you read this. I don't think Ancestry does that.
You know, that's a great comment that, you know, you can use the alert feature in FamilySearch. You've just done the important last step. You've written it up and let everyone know. Thank you so much for your time. It's been a